pleased to welcome Mark Durno with our focus on the environment. Mark has a career of monitoring and caring for the environment that spans 3 decades. He has served on the front line with the Environmental Protection Agency since 1997 as on-scene coordinator, supervisor, and deputy chief in the emergency response branch of the Superfund program. If you think he thrives on crisis, you're right. He's responded to numerous emergencies and crises, chemical and oil spills. He's given support to national counterterrorism planning and exercises, and he's assisted with international biological response training. He is the leader who responds in an emergency, and you've probably seen his name recently for coordinating the work in East Palestine. He's monitoring the water, soil, and air quality and answering questions in community meetings as recently as this week. He was also at the lead of the response to the crisis in Flint, Michigan, and he's coordinated or worked on Capitol Hill anthrax response, as well as assisted with Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. His dedication and his exemplary service earned him recognition as the EPA's National On-Scene Coordinator of the Year in 2007, and he received a gold medal for exceptional service in 2017. We're fortunate enough to have him as our Region 5 Supervisor Responder. Mark, thank you for making time to join us today. We look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you, Marianne. And I'd like to thank Rachel and Michelle Kane, my friend and neighbor, for inviting me to this session. I thought I'd give you a little fun fact before we get started. I'm here talking to you from our command post in Columbiana, actually. We set up a forward command post in Columbiana for the East Palestine response. So I spend my mornings here and I spend my afternoons down on site in East Palestine. But the fun fact is I actually grew up in this area. So having been here since February, it's been nice to be able to spend my evenings at my parents' house. I'm staying at my parents' house while responding to this spill. So most major responses we're living out of hotels. So this has been a nice change of pace for me. I thought the first thing I would do is give you a little bit more background. Marianne gave a great introduction about what we do in our program, but just a quick minute to tell you a little bit more about the Superfund Emergency Response Program. As Marianne noted, we respond to chemical spills and oil spills, and we also do what we call removal actions. And even though we're still responding to the East Palestine situation as an emergency response, the mechanisms that we're doing to force the responsible party, Norfolk Southern, to take action and to implement all the cleanup actions that we're requiring of them. We do it under what we call a removal administrative order to ensure that the work gets done timely and it gets done properly. And under that order, we ask the company to provide a number of removal action work plans to take care of all the different operational aspects we have here on the job site. We don't approve work plans until they meet our pretty stringent requirements for the completeness of the cleanup. And on the typical removal actions, you don't see us in the headlines. You don't see us in the news. What we're typically doing is addressing abandoned contamination sites. For example, the Cleveland fire chief, one of his staff may come across an abandoned industrial property, or Ohio EPA may be inspecting a commercial property through its cessation of regulation operations program, and they realize that on these properties, wastes have been left behind, abandoned drums or electroplating shops, contaminated soil situations. All various types of industrial and commercial sites may have wastes that have been left behind, laboratory chemicals, etc. So our job is to go out, assess those types of sites, determine whether or not there's a threat to public health or the environment, and if there is, compel the responsible party to do that work. In the abandoned site situation that I described, in often cases, those companies have gone bankrupt and there's really no funding mechanism to get that done. So that's when our tax dollars come into play. We have a network of emergency response and cleanup contractors that can do that work. Our job as EPA coordinators is to manage the work on site. So that's the basics of what we do in the emergency response program. The other aspect of my job, as Marianne noted, is Homeland Security. In EPA, we do have a very small Office of Homeland Security, and our job at our headquarters is to coordinate with the Department of Homeland Security to ensure that we're connected should another 9/11 type situation happen, and we can respond with the full force of the federal government. Within the regions, our regional offices in Chicago, and we have satellite offices around the region, including one here in the Cleveland area. And part of my job is to ensure that in a disaster-like a situation that we can maintain continuity of operations. So I do all the planning for our region to make sure our offices can continue to function in one of those situations. And as we all remember, we got challenged with continuity issues during the COVID pandemic. So that's when those types of plans come front and center. The other piece of it is chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear response planning. As you heard in the introduction, our team responded to the Capitol Hill Anthrax site. That was outside of a military facility. That's one of the first times a biological weapon was cleaned up in a civilian situation. And through the lessons learned and the science that we developed during that response, we kind of wrote the book on how to clean up accidental contamination sites and terrorism-based contamination sites moving forward. And those practices that we learned back in the early 2000s have been put into play into several civilian situations for other biological contaminants, not terrorism related, but the lessons learned did help us in the assessment and cleanup phase of other biological sites. And then the last piece of our background is preparedness. A good example of that is when a major event comes into Cleveland. For example, back in 2016, we had the Republican National Convention. We've had several all-star games with our, with the major sports leagues that we have in the city. So we work with our federal, state, and local partners to set up pre-deployment style preparedness programs to ensure that we're ready to respond. And in 2016, we did have to respond with some of our laboratory capabilities for some unknown substances that were discovered in or around the city of Cleveland while that national special security event was going on. So that's just a good overview of what we do in our emergency response program. But I really do want to turn my attention to what we're dealing with right now, because it's a significant situation for us. As I was telling Rachel before we started, this is probably one of the hardest jobs I've done, and mainly because, and please let me know if you can see my screen.
Not yet, Mark.
You got it or no?
No, there you go.
Okay, and mainly because not only are we dealing with a pretty extensive multimedia situation in terms of the level of contamination that's present from this train derailment and the subsequent fire that occurred, but the level of information challenges that we've had on this site have been pretty enormous. A lot of misinformation about how the incident affected the surrounding areas made this extremely challenging. And as that information filters into the community, there's a lot of fear and lack of understanding about what's really going on. So the communication side of this was every bit as challenging as the technical side of it. So on the screen, you can see 4 primary agencies listed. The City of East Palestine, or the village now because it has shrunk in size. Columbiana County Emergency Management Agency, the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency, and our group, EPA's Emergency Response Program. Both our Region 5 office, which covers Ohio, and our Region 3 office, which covers Pennsylvania, are involved in what we call our unified command. Even though the immediately dangerous to life and health portion of this response is over, we're still responding to this using a unified command mechanism, mainly because there are just so many moving parts to this response, as I'll explain in a minute. In the image, you can see this isn't the fire from the controlled burn or the vent and burn operation that happened several days after the initial fire. This is the actual initial fire. And the effects from the initial fire were every bit as severe as the effects from the vent and burn, and probably more so. In all, this fire affected roughly a half mile of the railroad track, as you can see in this image. And I'm going to show you another image to zoom in on a couple areas of interest. But in the middle of the photo, you can see the roughly 1/3 to 1/2 mile of railroad track that was impacted. But what's important in this image is to recognize the number of homes immediately to the southwest and northwest of the railroad tracks. And the yellow line you see on the right side of the screen is the Pennsylvania state line. So not only were we coordinating with all the Ohio local and state agencies, we're also coordinating with all the Pennsylvania local and state agencies, and we still are. So again, the coordination challenges from dealing with two states in this was also quite a challenge. But we partnered up well, and we've been moving forward in a pretty aggressive manner. A couple other notes from this image. In the lower right-hand side, you see a lot of blue structures. That's all the water containment, both contaminated and potentially contaminated water that's been collected from this site. Just north of that, in some of those outlined areas, that's where the wastes that are being dug up from the train derailment site have been staged and are being shipped out. And just to give you a sense of the extent of the work that we're doing here, over 43,000 tons of waste has already been shipped off-site for hazardous waste disposal. Disposal is happening at both hazardous waste incinerators and permitted hazardous waste landfills. We've also shipped off over 17 million gallons of contaminated water or potentially impacted water, also for proper disposal. So it's been a monumental effort, and I would venture to guess that we're probably about halfway done in terms of the solid waste. So I wouldn't be surprised if we're close to 100,000 tons when this is all said and done. So it really is quite a significant cleanup. And the primary contaminants, for those of you that are familiar with these compounds, are vinyl chloride, and butyl acrylate, and ethyl hexyl acrylate. Those compounds are hazardous for different reasons. The vinyl chloride is a carcinogen. The butyl acrylate and ethyl hexyl acrylate can be sensitizers. So just giving you a little bit more, close up of the actual work site itself. The areas dashed, or the area is the area of track that's been excavated. The south track has already been restored. The north track excavation should be done by the end of this week. The areas outlined in purple to the north and south of the tracks, those are areas that will be further evaluated. We anticipate having to dig out some more contaminated soil from those areas. And then we'll go into a longer term assessment program to ensure that there is no waste or hazardous substances encroaching on the nearby neighborhoods. While all this operation is going on, you saw the homes that were nearby this work site. It was important to make sure that we had a very solid air monitoring and air sampling program established. So this is the extent of air monitoring that we're doing in both Ohio and Pennsylvania. The different symbols represent different types of air monitoring devices that we have in the community. We also, this green line is what we call the Trace Atmospheric Gas Analyzing Vehicle. It's a roving gas chromatograph mass spectrometer that takes real-time air vapor readings, which we have calibrated for butyl acrylate and vinyl chloride for one of the other vehicles that we have in place. And that those vehicles operate and run this route full time while operations are going on. And operations can range from 10 to 12 hours a day, depending on the day. This is in addition to the air monitoring we're doing and the real-time analytical work that we're doing in the community. We're also collecting samples on a daily basis, on a 24/7 basis. So we have, in addition to monitoring, we have an extensive air sampling network going on as well. We also have an extent of contamination soil sampling program that's going on. This is just an aerial view of what that program looks like. The first phase of that program is complete. We're not seeing any noticeable impacts to the community based on the smoke plume that went downwind and crosswind from the site. We also have two waterways that are heavily impacted. One is called Sulphur Run. It's a creek that runs along the railway and through town. And another one called Leslie Run, which is cleaning up nicely due to the response efforts that have taken place to date. Leslie Run and the areas downriver from Leslie Run are cold water habitat areas that are home to some sensitive species and also some endangered species. So we're being very careful about how we remediate those areas. Just another image of the extent of contamination program we did around the community. The reason I show this slide is all the yellow dots that you see are areas we actually found evidence of soot or ash from the burn, which we didn't expect to see away from the derailment site. But we did discover it. Luckily, the sampling showed that only low levels of volatile organic compounds were present in that soot, which was good news. Finally, I could talk for about 2 hours about all the work that we're doing out here. But if you do want to learn more about the derailment site and the ongoing work, we have our webpage set up that you can see here. All of our community meetings, we do weekly information sessions with community members. We record those, we post those online, and you can view those and our weekly newsletters that go out to the community here at our website. So with that, I'll take any questions that you may have.
Mark, thank you so much for sharing the scope of your work. It's really quite hard to wrap your head around just how large this disaster was. Now, very curious, you've been meeting with the residents and having the community meetings. What are some of the things and the questions that you're hearing from them weekly as you continue to meet with them?
So, as you can imagine, and I mentioned the information challenges that we had early on. There's a lot of distrust in the community. I'll be straightforward with that. There's distrust of the company that caused the spill. There's distrust of government in general because of all the information challenges that were out there, a lot of the misinformation that was put out there. So a lot of clarifying questions are asked of us in those meetings. There are a lot of health concerns raised. Some of the community are experiencing some lingering health effects. Whether it was from the derailment or not, it doesn't matter. The fact that they are experiencing these effects are a concern. And as a result, we are continuing to work with our public health partners to try and address those issues. And again, clarifying exactly what we're doing has been, I guess the key in those meetings. Each information session is based on topic. The first topic was the external soil sampling program that we were doing. The next week was air monitoring sampling. The week after that, potable water. Over 500 well samples have been collected. Then surface water, and then this week is going to be on the track cleanup that I briefly described to you. So a lot of the questions stay on topic. Some of the questions venture into other areas. But we also have a welcome center that we've established in town to take on residents' questions one at a time. And we'll sit down and we'll walk with them through all the technical information that we're gathering. And that helps improve on those trust issues. That helps residents better understand when they can talk to somebody one-on-one as opposed to in a large public forum.
So you mentioned the large amount of waste that is being removed from the site. What happens next to that waste? Where do you go? How does that get disposed?
Yeah, great question. So let's talk about the solid waste first. There are two methods of disposal for the solid waste. One is hazardous waste incineration. So the waste that has higher volatile organic or vinyl chloride levels in them and are a bit, I would use the word wetter, go to the incinerators. The incinerators have a scrubbing system on there, so the waste gets burned and the resulting ash then gets disposed in a hazardous waste landfill. And the rest of the solid waste does not have as heavy a volatile organic concentration in it. Then it gets shipped to a licensed and properly permitted hazardous waste landfill. And there's those types of landfills exist in every state, in most states in the country. They are specially lined to be able to maintain these wastes for decades or centuries. and they are properly monitored and permitted. So they also have to meet an additional compliance check that US EPA does to make sure that they're meeting all the state's requirements to accept that waste. But yeah, it does. A lot of it does go into the ground for permanent disposal.
Based on what you're seeing in the area, what are some long-term anticipated effects that the area is going to see from this disaster?
So there's two sides of that, Rachel. The first is the return to normalcy, and having worked in numerous disaster sites over the years, what I've seen generally is it takes about 2 years to begin to feel normal if you were directly impacted by a disaster situation. For some people, return to normal happens a lot quicker. For others, it takes a lot longer. But from a community feel standpoint, my takeaway has always been it's been about 2 years. But more importantly, what about the hazardous materials? When the waste gets dug out, we are having them dig down to what we consider clean, which is meeting our lowest risk levels for the contaminants of interest that I mentioned earlier. But aside from that, the impacted waterways. Again, we don't want to go out and dig out some waterways that are critical habitat. So in Leslie Run, for example, we're going to use non-invasive techniques to break down the contaminants, just do some aeration in the sediments, continue to monitor the sediments. The half-life of most of these volatile compounds is somewhere between 40 and 60 days. So we expect them to break down over time, but it's going to take a lot of monitoring. So, we're going to be working on these rivers probably for months well into the remainder of 2023. And then there's the concern over drinking water. The East Palestine's municipal wells are groundwater wells. And so luckily the groundwater flow does not go from the site towards those drinking water wells. But nonetheless, geology can be a funny thing. So the state, Ohio EPA, set up a series of sentinel wells to monitor the groundwater long term to make sure we don't have any contaminants migrating towards the municipal well field. And also there are hundreds of potable wells on private lands that need to be protected as well. And so this sentinel well system the state set up will protect that. Will protect there. But that, again, we're looking at years to decades of monitoring. So just because we step away from this area here in by the end of 2023 doesn't mean there isn't going to be long-term monitoring going on for this. And lastly, I would note that again there are a number of residents who have expressed some concerns with ongoing health issues. So the National Institutes of Health is going to set up a series of workshops to look at long-term research for potential health issues that may have resulted from the fire. So there's going to be a lot of long-term activities going on. What they look like at this time next year, we'll see. But there will be years of work going on down the road.
What changes might be coming down around the transportation of hazardous materials to avoid situations like this in the future?
That's a great question. And that's a little bit out of my knowledge base. But I can tell you that every time we have a major disaster that lands on the federal government's radar, something changes. Give you a couple examples. Remember Love Canal back in the early 1980s? That created the Superfund program. That's the program that I work under. You might remember the Union Carbide incident in Bhopal, India. They created SARA Title III, which is community right to know laws. The Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1988 or 89 created OPA 90, or the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, which gives us all the authority that we need to respond to oil spills, which is different than Superfund. So I would not be at all surprised if there is some legislation passed that does create change in this industry. Another example, I worked on the Flint response, as you noted in the introduction. The WIN Act, or the Water Infrastructure for the Nation Act, Water Infrastructure Improvements for the Nation Act was passed, which created stricter requirements for cities to report and respond to infrastructure issues. So again, changes happen when major responses occur. So I'll be very interested in seeing what happens with the railway industry, because what happens with them certainly affects our organization, because we have to respond to these incidents.
So, Mark, you've mentioned that as part of the EPA, you responded to the anthrax attacks. And can you talk a little bit about why was the EPA involved with that and not, say, the CDC? Kind of where does your mandate end and begin?
Yeah. So under the Superfund law, we have the authority to respond to hazardous substances. Now, biological contaminants are not considered hazardous substances, but what they are considered are pollutants and contaminants. So there's a twist in the regulation that gives us that authority. When that particular incident happened, we assumed that it would be a public health-led response, because the contamination was isolated to certain buildings. The federal family got together and determined that the EPA, because of our authorities and abilities to respond to these types of incidents, we were better equipped to do the cleanup on that particular incident, and all the incidents that have occurred that have been similar since then, that were related. Conversely, when the Flint situation happened, that was actually led by Health and Human Services. EPA was under the Health and Human Services command structure in that model. And the main reason there was that did become a public health issue, because an entire city was impacted by the effects of lead, and a number of long-term health network programs had to be established, which fell right under the Health and Human Services umbrella. So we actually worked for them in that particular response. So the White House and the National Security Council will help the federal family determine who's best suited to be in the lead and who's best suited to be in support. Likewise, with disasters, FEMA, if it's a natural disaster and it falls under the Stafford Act, FEMA will be in charge, but they'll give the federal agencies responsibilities to take on particular aspects of that. EPA has responsibility under emergency support function number 10, which is oil and hazardous substances, or hazardous materials. So again, in those situations, yes, we're working for FEMA, but we have a direct responsibility to use that FEMA funding to meet our mission requirements. I hope that makes sense.
So how are you trained to respond to the unexpected and to keep your focus during times of crises? It can be such a demanding and exhausting period of time.
Yeah, it is. And especially for those of us, there's a handful of us that are here full time. You know, most of our staff out here are on a rotational basis. They come in and out every couple of weeks. But there's a handful of us that we stay on these full time to make sure we have that continuity. And honestly, Rachel, the best training is experience. We came into this job. I came in as a contractor in the early 90s, worked under these EPA contracts, learned the ropes, through experience. There are incident management and leadership courses that we take to be able to organize and coordinate, but there's no substitute for experience. So somebody fresh out of college, I wouldn't want them in my shoes right now. But those of us that have been doing it a long time, every response has its own unique challenges, and the way we get through them is from the experience that has been built over decades.
Well, Mark, we thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to share with us the work that you're doing and help us understand what's happening in our community. And thank you for all that you are doing to help the residents in the community of East Palestine.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. And it's going to be a long summer out here. So if you're in the area, look me up.
Yeah. Mark, thank you for all of your dedication. It's clear why you have been recognized and awarded with the awards that you have received. So thank you for your continued service.